we're starting with the keynote, so please take a seat. Hi, my name is Lily Irani, and I'm a faculty member in Communication and Science Studies, and it is truly my honor to introduce Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson to speak to us today. Dr. Johnson is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins University. She's the author of the upcoming book, Wicked Flesh, Black Woman, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World, from University of Pennsylvania Press, coming out next August. And she's also the editor with Dr. Mark Anthony Neal of a special issue of Black Scholar called Black Code. So by way of introducing Dr. Johnson, I wanted to read two sentences from two papers that she wrote that I thought are really that really connect a lot to some of the conversations we're having today, but also crucially reframe it. So from the introduction to this special issue of Black Code Studies in Black Scholar, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Neal write, Black Code Studies roots itself in the challenge of living in the wake of Black people rendered inhuman, non-existent, and disposable by the slave ship, the plantation, the colonial state, the prison, the border. Facing devastation again and again, Black folks need in and for each other becomes both time-traveling desire and reservoir of knowledge. And in a paper called Markup Bodies, what Dr. Johnson does is talk about the challenges of telling the history of slavery based on the data that's given by history through ship registers and owners' ledgers. And she writes, once again, metrics and minutiae neither lance historical trauma nor bridge the gap between the past itself and the search for redress. So I'm really excited to hear what Dr. Johnson has to say about how do we make a different kind of future of telling the history of humans, in the plural, alongside with and through data. So please join me in giving her a round of applause.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, evening-ish. I want to start by saying thank you to everyone here. Thank you, Joelle, for making all of the arrangements and keeping track of me. Thank you, Aaron, Laura, everybody, Robert, the graduate students who were in the workshop yesterday. It's been a really amazing, I hope everybody else feels this way, a really amazing couple of days that has brought a lot of people from different places and spaces together and has brought us across different geographies, even here in San Diego. So I think that that's really powerful and a really great way to generate and have a generative conversation about data and what data is doing. I want to start by acknowledging that I am honored to give this talk on land originally inhabited by the Kumeyaay, a site that San Diego is also a site of indigenous slavery and a state of California where chattel slavery did exist, particularly agricultural and mine labor. And that this is a history of slavery and genocide that, as Tiffany Thabo King says in her book, has no edges. So this presentation is focused on Black life, but that is not to the exclusion of indigenous genocide attempted by conquistador settlers who have been at that work since 1441. So I just want to start with that. I also want to ground our conversation today in a few stories. And hopefully, let me just set a timer so that I really don't go too long. One is the story of a woman named Catalina. She's listed in the slave registers as a mulatresse, which means presumably that she is half white and half Black, half of African descent, but those are always fuzzy things to determine from the actual records. She describes herself as 36 years old. She's there with her daughter, Felicite, who is only 5 years old. And she's enslaved to Jean Baptiste, in this record, this is a Spanish Louisiana, so it's Juan Baptista Destrehan. So this is the Destrehan plantation system. And she's there before the Spanish Cabildo, which is the ruling body of Louisiana, this late 18th century moment. And she's attempting to secure her freedom. They were enslaved on the Destrehan plantation, but this plantation is actually being managed by a name that might be familiar to some historians or Americanists as Etienne Boré, who is textbooks kind of claim him as having refined sugar, having made sugar plantation cultivation possible in Louisiana. So Catalina intended to use a process called coartación to secure her freedom. It's basically a process by which she goes before the Spanish Cabildo, says that I need to be free for XYZ number of reasons, and the Cabildo assigns an appraiser to evaluate her and how much she's worth. She gets a carta, which is a writ of freedom that once she pays off, and sometimes people come with third parties who are willing to just buy them free carte blanche. She does actually have one of those. So once she pays that off, she will be free. If she were in Cuba, she'll be a cortado, but here in Louisiana, she's just a free woman. She will be a free woman of color. She makes this claim to want a carta by saying that she'd been good to the estate, but she was often sick. She has this daughter. She'd been in service to this family for however many years, and she has somebody who is willing to buy her free. And this money can then go to this plantation and the estate and the owners, and they can buy somebody who is much more worthy. She even says that it's even better for you to have a young African boy, a young Negro boy, instead of me. I'm old, I'm infirm, what will you do with me? Her third party, money man, and he's a man, says that he will actually, put up the money, he thinks it's a good idea, etc. Boré pushes back against the petition. Etienne Boré. He's frustrated. He answers, quote, that in no manner will he consent to giving her freedom, considering her bad conduct, her iniquity, her dissimulation, and what she had done to herself to be valued more cheaply. So that's one story. Second story is a shorter one. It's the story of Louis. Louis in 1764 in Louisiana. Now, at this point, Louisiana is under the French control. Louis begins to appear at a series of nighttime feasts that are being organized by a woman named Mama Kumba, also enslaved. Louis is a slave. These feasts are organized by a group of enslaved Senegambians in the courtyards of New Orleans. Sometimes he appears with another man named César, who is his compatriot. He seems to come out of nowhere, which sort of makes the dinner guests a little bit nervous. But he claims he had a pass from his mistress in Illinois country. So if you think of Illinois country as sort of in relation to New Orleans, where St. Louis is. Because he had a pass because he had a sore leg, and until it was healed, he was free. Now that's his quote to officials, and of course, officials find them because Louis, while he is away, being free, he steals livestock, clothing, becomes familiar with women, including Mama Kumba. And when he's eventually apprehended, he is apprehended as a runaway. They don't believe that he has this pass. He can't quite produce it. And so his punishment is thorough. And ends in his death. So that's the second one. The third story and the last. In 1743, a man named Jeannot is sentenced to death. He's a slave of a man named Leonard, who they're living in the area around New Orleans, the right bank, and if I get to that slide, that will make much more sense later on in this talk. And according to the case against him, he'd risen up against his owner. He had threatened to set fire to his owner's cabin, beaten the overseer, and claimed that he knew who was responsible for this other white man who had disappeared. Now, everybody who is white in the testimony, white and French for the most part, is claiming that this man is dead. This man has only disappeared there's no evidence, his body has not appeared. You know, in a lot of ways, it's actually not the point of this story. The point is that the evidence for the so-called death of this disappeared white man relies on the claim that a chanson de nègres, which is either a dance or a song or an entire event, was heard the day before his disappearance as either a cause of the disappearance or a premonition or a celebration, and therefore of his death. So these are three particular stories from slavery's archive. Slavery to slave trade and plantation empires of the 18th century, we know this, I hope. They generated massive amounts of data. 4/5 of those crossing the Atlantic from the Old World to the New were Africans, mostly enslaved, sometimes occasionally free. Current estimates of the trade based on extant slave ship registers hovers around 12.5 million, as you can see up here. But even those are not the complete story. For instance, Jennifer Morgan notes David Wheat's archive of some 80,000 Africans who were transported between present-day Senegambia to Cartagena de Indias between about 1570 and 1640. And if you wanted to, you could take a look at even just sort of one particular archive that covers maybe 1 century, Louisiana Colonial Documents Project, a digitization project at the Louisiana Historical Center, which is where the 18th century records of the French and Spanish period have been housed. French-Spanish period of Louisiana have been housed. They've digitized 220,000 pages, no small part of it involving the sale, exchange, manumission, and administration of the enslaved as owners come before the council, just as these 3 found themselves before the council and exchange commodified bodies and an economy of slavery and agriculture, among other things. And so this documentation begins around 1714, ends around 1803. You also have other databases and projects that may be familiar. Gwendolyn Hall's massive database of enslaved Africans in Louisiana identifies about 100,000 enslaved and free Africans in Louisiana from the same moment, 1714-ish, all the way up to emancipation. This is a data set that has about 1 million discrete entries. And it was also inspiration and something of a model for Enslaved, which is enslaved people of the historic slave trade, a conference hosted at Matrix at Michigan State University. So this is a massive endeavor meant to bring together databases like this with all of their entries using linked open data to link to each other. So although these are separate databases with separate systems and separate ways of knowledge, separate ontologies, since we've talked a lot about ontologies. The idea behind Enslaved is to find a way to find the stable points of the data, find the stable identifiers, create identifiers if necessary, and try and create biographies of individuals using information in different databases. It brings together databases and research from Cuba, Brazil, West Africa, as well as across the United States. And MSU has had 2 conferences as part of this work, one in 2012 and one in 2019, and it's ongoing, and it's literally trying to capture billions of records generated by the exchange, the crossing, and the lives of enslaved people across the Atlantic world. So data like this, as you can imagine, is too much for the human mind to process at once. Although, well before the current iteration of the database, historians have actually tried. Phil Curtin's census of the slave trade from African Americans is a famous one, and it is often cited, but before him, W.B. Du Bois attempted to write a history of 2 events that generated huge explosions of data. One of them is the famous suppression of the African slave trade to the United States of America, which has it's a massive endeavor, plenty of charts and other kinds of organized material in there, trying to again, corral this massive data from the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade. And then there's also Black Reconstruction. So it's interesting that sort of the inception of slavery in the US context, at least, generates this huge amount of data. And then the explosive end of slavery, at least as we knew it from the 19th century in the US, because it does not end everywhere technically until the 1880s in Brazil, also generated a massive explosion of data. So the counter of Black freedom generates explosions of information. And Du Bois attempted to corral them, and these have had particular kinds of staying power, so it's not as though he did a poor job at them. And these might also be familiar, particularly given there's a new collection that's been released, compiled and edited by Whitney Battle Baptiste. These are Du Bois's late 19th and early 20th century data portraits visualizing Black America. They were created as part of the 1900 World Exposition in Paris. And so he drafted, these are just 4 of them, about 60 different charts, graphs, and maps. They're meant to visualize Black life and the state of Black life, particularly in this post-emancipation opening of the 20th century moments. They're hand-drawn. Imagine that. And they were part of an exhibit of American Negroes, which he did in collaboration with Thomas Calloway and Booker T. Washington. So this is the contribution of US Black people to the World Exposition. You also have scholars like Carter G. Woodson, early African-American historians and historians of African-American history who also were concerned with data and concerned with research and sources and how we identify the impact of slavery, plantation empire, plantation economies on Black life. Again, this is focused on the US, although Carter G. Woodson did have interests that were diasporic, that were West Africa, that were the Caribbean, that were Brazil in particular. But Carter G. Woodson at Howard University has an entire team of people going through censuses, going through state records, federal records, and trying to compile a source material that in the moment of him doing it, so we're talking about the 1920s, 30s, 40s, he is part of a move of Black historians and historians in general who are trying to think about what role history will have in the uplift of the race, what role history will have in questions of social justice. This, of course, is a moment of the early, quote-unquote, civil rights movement, you could say, also a moment that some people have called the nadirs. 1919 is Red Summer of lynching. This is a moment when historians, scholars are turning to research methods and trying to think about what role does this work play in literally fundamentally saving Black lives. And so Carter Woodson, among other things, is putting his research team to work and creating sources like this, material like this that can do that work. And actually to think with Shannon, is Shannon still here? Did I put her on the spot if Shannon's not? Hey, all right. To think with Shannon's talk from yesterday, the federal government is also, maybe unwittingly, also part of this process. So if you think of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, their writers' projects, interviewing the last descendants of those who have been enslaved in order to, maybe they wouldn't have called it compiling data, but they were compiling research material, trying to get and save as much material as possible firsthand, from the mouths of those who had experienced slavery. And in fact, some of the work that may be unrelated to those who were free people, some of their work compiling abstracts for places like Louisiana's Historical Center, where the WPA went through the French records and the Spanish records of the Cabildo, the Spirit Council and the Cabildo, and did abstracts, sometimes long summaries, sometimes very short and brief, from those materials, wrote them in English. The work that historians are trying to do on the Gulf Coast or Louisiana is actually made immeasurably easier by some of this early research work that was just, in some ways, generating material, structuring material, structuring data, restructuring it, so that people can access it and understand it. And at the same time, you have these fissures, these blank spaces and empty fields, and then indeterminate data, these null values that permeate slavery's archival landscape. Jennifer Morgan, for instance, has noted the importance databases like the slave trade database have been, how important they have been for analyzing gender in the slave trade. This is a topic that until really the work of scholars like her, Barbara Bush, Rada Reddick, Vereen Shepard, more recently Stephanie Smallwood, Shawane Mustakim, gender was sort of seen as incidental to the slave trade because of the so-called demand for prime pièce d'âne, so prime slaves, which would have been a male 8 to 35 years old, able-bodied. The assumption was that gender was therefore a non-factor because of the sort of overimposed demand of plantation owners. And then come to find out that's not entirely true, that in some cases, in some eras, in some places, women and children actually are the majority and are actually potentially more desired. So even still, and in further layer, although the database does offer information about gender that is there on the slave ship registers, at least as far as who is female or male, there are still ships in the database that lack gender ratios at all. And I can say this also from my own research. There's ships in the database that not only lack gender ratios, they lack information on passengers, they lack information on African and European employees on the ships, details about slave ship revolts, of which there were many, other forms of mutiny and resistance. Daryl Williams working closely with the enslaved database, and in particular the Brazilian records in it, which are especially rich, and especially rich well into the 19th century, which gives us a nice long durée perspective of the ways that slaving changes and shifts over time. Has also noted the kind of potential tensions of using materials meant to reduce Africans to their most base characteristics to compile biographies. What, for instance, do we do with these many variations of race, ethnicity, color, occupation, even gender across slaveholding societies, languages, and owners themselves? So Williams notes and has talked about in his work the ways that this is a methodological tension that scholars of slavery themselves have, as historians, we've long been confronted with this. But the codification of the database and the primacy of the digital and of data in the academy and increasingly in society more broadly, and the gentleman who presented on Nokia sort of got at some of this also in the ways that the presumption that the computer has said it, therefore now it must be true, almost shuts down a part of our brain. And so therefore, yes, you know, where we might then ask certain questions about what a mulafes is and means and how that actually operates as far as biopolitics and blood quantums, we seem to want to ask those questions less when it's appearing before us in a database. So there's a struggle, an endemic struggle between clean and messy data, and that struggle is now systemic. And we see that when we're thinking of this in the context of histories of slavery. So to return to the three stories from earlier, so Catalina, Louis, and Jeannot / the Chanson des Nègres, I'd argue more than messy data is sort of at stake when we're considering what data does to the humanities work that we want to do. In each of these examples, there is missing information, data that might have been useful for those seeking Black lives in archives steeped in Black death. So what did Catalina do to herself to be valued more cheaply? Did she maim herself? Is she ingesting something to make herself sick? Has she been pregnant too many times? Was Louis truly on his path, or was he running away? What does a Negro scream in the night even mean? A chanson des nègres. How is that enough evidence to sentence someone to death? Seeking and sort of seeing, to the extent that we can, the fissures and silences, the messy and the null, I'm reminded of Catherine McKittrick's reflection on the violence of classification and cataloging, particularly when attending to the humanity of Africans propelled into diaspora and the legacy of slavery, and the overstructuring role, we've talked a lot about philosophy the last couple days, the overstructuring role Western bodies of knowledge have had on how to comprehend that experience. So in writing an essay on deconstructing, that it was composed in part of a deconstructed encyclopedia entry for diaspora, McKittrick notes that there is as much to know as not to know when entering the lists. Her deconstruction of the structured, data of the entry is epigraphed by Fanon, I entered a list, quote unquote, but also brings to mind, of course, Nobese Phillips' poetic deconstruction and reconstruction of the African slave ship Zong. It also, in some ways, brings us to think through and with another African diaspora theorist, Martinican Edouard Glissant, who wrote Poetics of Relation while in residence in Louisiana. And the idea of opacité, the legitimate diasporic Caribbean claim to the inscrutable, the opaque, the clouded mirror. Glissant, who like McKittrick, deconstructed and reconstructed diaspora to better suit the messy data that is and was Black life in the Western Hemisphere, created this table, among other ways and formulations, like these deeps, like the open boats versus boats with bellies. So here today, as we kind of discuss and have discussed data, culture, art, and humanities together, I want to suggest that there's a way of thinking with these relationships between slavery's archive, digitization, datification, and one of the things, one of the framings that I want to kind of think with you all with is what I call crossroads praxis. I think of a crossroads praxis as a tinsel strength that centers Black life in the digital humanities, and as a result demands a more human, accountable, ecologically sustainable, dare I say, decolonial vision for doing digital and data work. A crossroads practice is a collaboration, potentially, between slavery, the digital humanities, and Black theory. So how might a crossroads praxis fit into this work? First, it makes sense to demystify the digital humanities a little bit. I don't know if anybody has seen this or seen me talk about 4DH, but one of the ways that I kind of ask people to think about the digital humanities is in these kind of 4 different tiers. So, and I think actually all of these are represented here today, which is really interesting. This is unusual for when I'm at an academic-ish conference. Digital humanities, capital D, capital H, is digital humanities within the academy. Financed, big centers, lots of funders. Digital humanities that gets, awards from the big institutions, MLA, AAHA, et cetera. Digital humanities, humanities work that is maybe rendered digitally, and that could be pretty broad. That could be something on a Kindle, it could be a Twitter chat conversation. Digital humanities, lowercase, is got fuzzy edges. Digital media. Digital media, capital D, capital M, same thing. Bigger funders than the academy, usually. Google, Nokia. Content created online, CNN. Once upon a time, these were not sites that existed. HuffPost was a thing that got created maybe the last 10, 20 years. So there was a time where we read newspapers and got our news mainly from analog and paper form. That time is probably still here-ish. But digital media is, in some ways, a news landscape that we live in today. But it's the same thing. And so if we're thinking of power, if we're thinking of funding, of money, and of who gets to determine what a fact is, who gets to determine what news is, who gets to determine what scholarship is, those are the capitalized ones, DH and DM. Digital practice is, as you can guess, the one that I find in a lot of ways most interesting. It's both that happens to engage in the digital, and the digital is insurmountable and everywhere. It's that kind of category. It's the acknowledgement, which in some ways is a little scary for some, probably nobody here, but a little scary for some, that our digital isn't just connected to the humanities, and our humanities is inextricable from the digital. We have probably long since hit a tipping point there. It's found in millennialism, OK Boomer, in the apocalyptic reads of the changing face of publishing, English majors, reading, writing, history, security, surveillance. It's in the failures, like say, of a certain app in Iowa. It's everyone in this room on their phone or on their computer. And it has changed, possibly forever, how humanists are doing their work. What's interesting is for histories of slavery, this kind of sea change of technology and the interface of technology with slavery's archive, this is not the first time this has happened. So August Meyer and Elliot Rudwick talk about in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the accessibility of certain technological tools that allowed more rapid fire computation of things like the slave trade, of things like how much food is being fed to enslaved people on plantations, et cetera, that actually revolutionized the study of slavery. It both made it more attractive, it opened up new kinds of research tools, et cetera, et cetera. So you have new kinds of studies that are coming out at that moment. The 1990s, you have a similar situation that begins to happen, I think, and we're sort of at the end and sort of transition point of that now, where, as Darrell Williams has pointed out, the advent of personal computing and mobile devices is once again changing both our access to the history and to the sources and to the archive, but also our relationship to that history and the immediacy of that history. And anybody who's been following the news around the 1619 Project will be very, very familiar with this. So, and if you haven't, you can just Google #1619 Project. You can do it right now if you want to. So, understanding these levels of DH, I think, helps kind of situate why a crossroads praxis, I think, might be an important framing and reframing of work, particularly work that is thinking about slavery and slavery's archive. And I will note, something like the theory of intersectionality, the framework of intersectionality, which is rooted in Black women's experience and their relationship to the state, a crossroads practice is also rooted in Black people's experience with systems of slavery, bondage, and colonialism and empire. That said, it does not mean that it can't be a useful model for how people deal with the dispossessed in their work, and or how people's relationship to data and the digital may change or shift. So I just want to make sure we think about that. So a crossroads praxis evokes what I'd like it to evoke is African diasporic intellectual and cultural production. The crossroads plays a sort of central role in systems of belief, in cosmologies, and histories, and social life. The crossroads is where, according to diasporic Yoruba practices and beliefs, Elegua or Papa Legba grants a humble petitioner or practitioner access to the spirit world. The crossroads is linked at times to the Bakongo cosmogram. It is a symbol found at enslaved burial sites, carved into headstones. It's created, as created by enslaved and free Black Africans who wanted to leave artifacts marking their transition point into the land of the dead. It is the crossroads in the 18th and 19th century, before the institutionalization of prisons, like Louis, actually, was where those who were convicted of crimes were beaten, were flogged, were executed. So it's also an important marker of the realities and the fleshness of Black violence and Black death, or violence and death and criminality. And at the crossroads in contemporary US folk culture, the devil meets heroes and fools. Those in the wrong and those wrong. It's where, for example, Robert Johnson, a famous blues musician, made his deal with the devil, giving up his soul for supernatural musical ability. So what will we give up at the crossroads for the ability to control and understand data? In a crossroads praxis, Black life is no longer invisible, although it may retain a kind of redacted and unknown quality, if you think of the kind of X. It doesn't shy away from ephemerality. Instead of finding limits in the absence, a crossroad praxis uses silence as a kind of maroon code. It allows absconded figures, bodies in freedom. It offers, in that kind of silencing, the opacité, the obscure and the obscured, practicum on what, how, and how our digital selves could be if we dare to embrace a sensorium of hauntings that have been left behind by slavery and colonialism. So by invoking a crossroads practice, I'm demanding that scholars create data without losing affect, sensation, kinship as a framing for Black life. A crossroads praxis, for instance, requires participation in rootedness, in queerness, in corporeality, in desire. It self-consciously deals in dead things. And I really want to emphasize that because that is a piece that is part of other bodies of knowledge, other ways of thinking about relationship to life, death, immortality, the body itself, the world. There is a ubiquity, a quotidian element of death and what it means to be Black. It is a characteristic that spans time and place. A crossroads practice doesn't run from that. It self-consciously deals in dead things. All right, so, let's see. this, what I just played is the second track from Martina Roberts' Coin Coin, chapter 1, Jean de Couleur Libre, titled Pauvre Piti. So Pauvre Piti means poor little one in Creole or Creole. And it's the title of a Creole folk song found along the Gulf Coast, most often referring to a woman who has lost the love of her life. Martina Roberts is a sound experimentalist, a jazz saxophonist, a composer, and an improviser. And the slide just before this is graphical notation that she made while she was composing this first project that she would spread, and there's many forms of it that are now gone unless you were following her and you save it. So save your faves things. She spread those across her social media, Instagram, Tumblr. I don't believe she was on Twitter at that point. And across the different chapters of Coin Coin, of which now we're on 4. Which, I think the most recent one is called Memphis. She continues to kind of disappear and then sort of pop back up on social media. So I think she's now back on Tumblr. For one of the chapters, she spent a year or so traveling the US, visiting sites in the South, Northwest. And this is an attempt to kind of trace her family tree, of which she is descended from Coin Coin, which is the nickname or the family, the company, the kinship name, the family name, internal family name of Marie-Thérèse Coin Coin Métayer, the founder of the Cane River Creoles community of Natchitoches, Louisiana. Coin Coin was born as a slave in 1742. Her owner, Louis Saint-Denis, was the commandant, the official, the governor of Natchitoches when it was a rural outpost. In 1767, a yellow fever epidemic decimated the outpost, killing Coin Coin's mother and her owner. And in the wake of her passing, her ownership passed over to a man, Claude Thomas Pierre Métayer. Now you'll notice that the name I gave you originally had the surname Métayer. Coin Coin bore Métayer several children, some of whom that he freed. He did not free her initially. But by 1778, he did finally free her. And as she did, as a free woman of color, she took advantage of laws like coartación to get others free, took advantage of Spanish laws on land settlement, which allowed you to improve a plot of land and then take it on as ownership of yourself. And so eventually, she and her children became some of the wealthiest free people of color, people of African descent in that region of Louisiana. And that is a video from rehearsals for a performance project called Vessels, and that will be launching in New Orleans in March 26th to 29th of this year. A 7-woman harmonic meditation on the Middle Passage. Co-shaped by Rebecca Moisset and producer Ron Reagan, Vessels is a ritual offering, musical performance, dance, and song to conjure 2 distinct historical spaces, the carceral world of the slave ship and the world of the spirit, a place of freedom. In creating Vessels, Moisset was guided by a singular question: what does freedom sound like in a space of confinement? So Moisset and Reagan's Vessels and Robert's intellectual and creative works around Coin Coin are examples in sort of 2 different sides, and we can talk about what the 2 sounds, audio visuals, evoked for you. But in some ways, across a spectrum of engaging in slavery and what I'm calling as kind of digital, falling the terrain of digital practice. Using social media tools, in Moise's case, IG and free-ish platforms like SoundCloud for Roberts, and slipping in and out of sight, particularly Roberts, who is doing this on and off social media, each illustrate the kind of interventions that Black digital practice, in this case, makes in digital humanities work, justice work, and doing histories of slavery. So their engagement, to kind of break down in a crossroads praxis, is manifold through multimedia, it's multimodal, but most of all, it's a flesh and blood evocations of the demand of slavery scholarship, that it be in conversation with Black theory and Black historical scholarly traditions, that it be attuned to the survivors of bondage, that it center Black women and femmes, Black women as femmes, as integral to the functioning of slavery and its resistance, that it have sound, that it have visual, that it have movements, that it root itself in living community, and that it deal in mourning as well as the dead. So this is Coin Coin, well, that was Coin Coin, that's Martina Roberts in one of her performances. This is a scene from Vessels. So a crossroads praxis deals in this kind of mourning and death, deals in the haunting of slavery, the ghost in the machine of the world we've made today. This here, there's no sound. There's no sound for it. There's really no sort of discussing haunting without discussing Marissa Parham's really critical work on hauntings, on Black political life in the Black Anthropocene. As Parham notes, and this is sort of a clip that she posted on Instagram from the Project Breakdance, which is part of this most recent Small Acts Archipelagos issue on slavery and the machine. You can find it there if you want. And this is a page that breaks down parts of Beloved in that project. So as Parham notes in a even more recent essay on Blackness and DH, to be haunted is to experience other people's memories with the effective impact of personal firsthand experience to both survive and operationalize the glitch, the break, the experience of Blackness that Fred Moten describes as the ongoing eruption that arranges every line. And it also notes what might it be to articulate tech as endemic to African American experience. And here, Parham is talking from one of the most recent debates in DH. Dealing in dead things also means dealing in memory and mourning. To turn to another example, and I should note that to experience other people's memories with the effective impact of personal firsthand experience is almost an ontology of social media. So we can also set that aside as a way and a way to think about why social media remains actually important as part of how we engage and engage it as part of digital and data practice. All right.
Sometimes forgets about relationships, because it tries to deal with too much abstraction. And in the end, it's the relationships which are so important, especially in a world like today where there's so much disaster and so much fragmentation. I think the notion of relationship, which you have just suggested, is very, very important. Yeah, that's a good point to bear in mind. And in fact, when you listen to our poets, it might be a good idea to discern who is aware of the importance of relationships and who is not.
Born to slow.
Ignore that. So, for anybody who does not know, and don't admit it if you don't, this is Kamal Brathwaite, fabulous, fantastic, amazing Caribbean poet, theorist, scholar who passed away recently, which has been a huge blow for those who do anything related to the Caribbean. And this was posted on the site, also an Instagram site called King Curate. So King Curate is the brainchild of curator and indie creator and root worker Inasa Crockett. And it's more than sort of a Black visual culture resource. And I would click through, but I worry about losing some of the slides that I have. So if you want me to show you some of these sites, the Instagram and the grid and some of the beauty of seeing all of this in a grid, I'm happy to put that up after. So it is certainly a Black visual culture resource, and that would certainly be enough if that's all it was. But Crockett, who describes themselves as an indie public scholar of Black performance, culture, politics, history, and theory, a digital curator and archivist, a root worker, also centers slavery and diaspora in their work. Along with curating a blog called Anti-Blackness is a Theory, Crockett uses the digital to link theories around Black death, violence, and the genocidal consequences of slaving in the past and present to the particular visions of the future that Black folk, especially in the US South, have imagined through music, through poetry, through hoodoo, magic, and the supernatural. So Can Curate is in some ways also an exhibition space, as well as an archive, that through reposts and annotations potentially confronts the algorithmic intensity of something like Instagram, where, say, Selena Gomez is the most followed person on IG. It also confronts the kind of conversations that resurrect themselves like zombies every other year about what is classically beautiful and who is classically beautiful and how that can now be quantified and encoded and what machine has encoded it today, and almost never are those people of color more broadly. So what does it mean to curate space for ghosts, for mourning, for an unapologetic visualization of Blackness, which is often seen only in distorted, inhuman, and monstrous capacities? And again, thinking with the keynote from yesterday, we can also think about ecological catastrophe as part of mourning and as part of Black mourning, not just the Black Anthropocene, which, as Marissa Parham has formulated it, but the Plantationocene, which is a revision of the Anthropocene that is meant to give a name to what kind of human interventions have actually helped destroy the planet, and how that has attended and led to the climate crisis. So all of this also is a way to think about practice in mourning. Oh, see, and I did have one clip from, this is part of one of a different series. Okay.
I don't know if you can see it, but there is a tree laid across the power lines down here, right there. So, yeah, did some pretty good dance around this piece. I wonder where the cow's at. My beautiful mother.
So this is from a project led in part by J.T. Rohn, who called Mapping Ecologies, Mapping Black Ecologies. With the idea that, so a series of tornadoes, 5 tornadoes, touched down in the state of Virginia in October 2018, with huge ramifications for those who are in the area, very little of a ripple effect on mainstream media, the D and the M digital media. And so one of the things that Rohn and his partner are charting are the ways that this manifests within the community, the ways that those people who live in Virginia are refusing to be disappeared in media in the midst of a climate catastrophe. And use tools as simple as YouTube to publicize themselves. We also saw a version of this with Puerto Rico, people using social media to find family members. Alex Gilles also had a team doing work around bringing people together at places across the country, but he was based at Columbia University, called Pierre on the Map, that was trying to map where people were at in the wake of Hurricane Maria, in the wake of the storm. So we have Puerto Rico there, as it was only a couple of days after, that's the bottom image, after Maria hits. And ecological catastrophe and crisis, and using just the tools that are available to you to confront the algorithmic bias that disappears these moments, particularly in Black communities, that confronts the tendency of the DM and sometimes the DH to not witness and not acknowledge the impact that these have on the dispossessed and marginalized and people of color more broadly. These are other examples. The one in the left corner is the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. And even in the midst of all of this, and these are the last examples, and then I hope we can have a robust conversation, there's still missing data. Even in the way that Black folk, the folk, have pressed the tools, have taken advantage of all the tools that are available to them to make themselves seen, there is still the issue of missing data and what we do with it.
These are, I call them missing data sets. Really what I'm talking about is in spaces that are like oversaturated with data collection, there will be these blank spots where there's nothing collected at all. And once you start to dive into them, you realize that they almost universally intersect with the interest of the most vulnerable members of the group. So I'm interested in like examining that space in a lot of ways. The Broadway theater world, there's no data collected on the ethnicity of actors and actresses on the stage. And this group of Asian American actors and actresses realized this and were like, this is terrible. Like, we need this data. They all came together and they were like, we have to do this on our own. If the powers that be are not interested in this, like, we have to do something. So then it becomes this interesting case of like surveillance as opposed to surveillance, where it's like, we are going to collectively gather. And that to me seems really interesting. I think one of the most important categories that they're interested in is what they call non-traditional casting. For them, non-traditional casting is when you have a role and it doesn't say anything about the race, which means typically implicitly like it will be given to a white actor or actress, and those roles go to people of color. That is really the true measure of like, are we able to see people fitting in different categories? And if we get more people like that, then it's like, we're doing, like, things are changing. In ways that they felt like they were being dismissed before when they would bring up these issues, now they're not. Because they're like, look, we can actually say that we've been counting this. So we know that you're not actually employing that many people of color. Part of, I think, the interesting thing about these missing data sets is making clear something that is felt or experienced already by people, by a group, but that others are unaware of. What I'm trying to do in a lot of ways, I think I've got these like multiple layers of goals, and one of them is super sort of straightforward. And for each project I'm doing, I'm like, I want to help this group be able to sort of explain what it is, like their interest, and like help them. So like with the Broadway, I'm like, here, I want to help you get this data up and let people see it. But then the higher level interest is like, I want us to show that these are different examples and they all demand different things. Like, there isn't just one way to do all of this stuff.
So what's great about, and Mimi Onoua says this themselves, is that the word missing is inherently normative. It implies both a lack and an ought, something that does not exist. Along with the data set that she was talking about with Broadway and plays, she also visualizes, and it's actually a physical filing cabinet. So again, with the way that like bridging what's in the screen and what is sort of like intangible with actually having to physically open the filing cabinet and it being there in a place and you're confronted with it. She also is sort of visualizing missing data sets like victims of police brutality. Or victims of police violence, murders by the police, which until recently, The Guardian started counting a couple of years ago. Until recently, there was nobody counting that data, so surveillance on that. Those who are caught at the border, and what happens to them? Are they deported? Are they incarcerated? Until recently, and even still, I believe it's still sort of patchwork. It's not clear, actually, how many and what happens to those who encounter ICE or Border Patrol or the police or empowered or disempowered militias. And so these are the kind of data sets that everybody is talking about, and yet nobody is talking about. As she notes, thinking about these kinds of data because it doesn't exist doesn't actually mean it's missing. The idea of missing data sets is tied to more expansive climate of inevitable and routine data collection. So last thing I'll mention is that in this kind of terrain of missing data and null values, I'm currently an African American digital humanities scholar at University of Maryland, and part of my work is thinking about, okay, not in the same terrain, in the same family of missing data sets, how can null values, or how can a null value might be a way to kind of surface some of the missing who are in these censuses, some of these stories like the Chanson des Nègres, and some of the people who end up either not counted for various reasons, or try to circumvent the counting, like Louis had his past and tried to circumvent the counting. And so these are visualizations that I'm working through with some of Gwendolyn Hall's database data, and then a Twine spell that is still very much in progress, but I'm happy to talk about in question and answer. So I will leave it there. Hopefully plenty for us to think about, and thank you so much.